Okay, guys, welcome back. Key Knowledge 8, the effect of change on stakeholders. So here we have study design, and here we are. You can see we're pretty close to the bottom of this one, guys. So we're nearly at the end of the outcome and therefore the course. So the effect of change on stakeholder groups, including, and then it gives us a whole bunch of stakeholders that it wants us to focus on. So again, we have a script here to follow and to stick to, and that is what I shall do through this video. So what is this one all about generally? Okay, so we've been talking about change for a while now, right since the beginning of Unit 4. The reasons it might need to happen, the ways in which managers can make the process kind of happen and manage the process effectively. So I guess you could argue that the next logical step in the process to think about the effect or the impact that the change that you're trying to kind of implement can have on the different stakeholders in or of a business. Okay. Now remember, stakeholders. Okay, we've seen stakeholders before early on in the course. Stakeholders are basically people that are somehow connected to the business. A good definition being individuals or groups who have a vested interest in the activities of a business. So that connection might be really, really strong. For example, employees, or a little less strong, such as maybe the general community, but there's still a connection between the business and the general community. And when we talk about general community, and I think I'll talk about an example of this later in the video, if you're talking about a big city like Melbourne, that connection tends to be a little bit more spurious. But when we're talking about country towns, regional towns around Australia, the impact that business has on a community can be absolutely huge. Okay, so we will get into this. So the stakeholders mentioned specifically in the study design, these are the ones that they mention in that key knowledge dot point. So that's the 6 that I'm going to talk about here. So basically what we're saying is managers need to be aware of the effects of any changes that they're making in the business on each of these stakeholders. And there's going to be positive and negative impacts, and that's kind of how we structure this. For each of those groups, we're going to talk about them in terms of the positive and the negatives. And therefore, if you're aware of the negative impacts that potentially could happen, if you're aware of them, you could put strategies in place to minimize those negative impacts. So look, before we even get into that, look, a real simple example, okay? Take the example of air travel, okay? So not very long ago, you go to the airport and you would go to a checkout counter and you would give the person, their bags, they would tag your bags, put them on the conveyor belt to, get on the plane. You'd be given your ticket, paper ticket like that one. It was all very kind of a manual process. Now you go to the airport. Usually now you're checking in your own bags at like a self-serve check-in. You're dropping your own bags at the self-serve bag drop. And you might even end up, instead of a paper ticket, you might end up with some kind of e-ticket, which is on your phone, which is then going to be scanned before you board the plane. So the whole process has very much changed. So just think about the impact of that change on even just the employees of the airlines and the customers. Okay, big change for both groups. And this is kind of what we're talking about here, making sure we're aware of the changes that these groups are going to kind of go through so that we can minimize any negative ones that are perceived by either group. So getting on to these stakeholder groups that are identified, the first one was owners. Okay, so business owners are obviously usually the ones that are making lots of major decisions, and anything to do with change is going to fall into that category. Okay, they may be the stakeholder that's initially suggesting the change in the business, and you're usually going to have the final say on how the change is going to happen. As the owner has a financial stake in the business, and possibly if it's a small business that you operate, it might even be your livelihood. Clearly, they can be hugely affected by change. So, and this is how this is going to look. So potential positive impacts. If the change is, successful, increased return on investment and financial security for the owners, opportunities to develop leadership skills and build stronger relationships with other stakeholders, key being employees, maybe the opportunity to be perceived in a more positive light by the employees if the change is implemented successfully. Flip side of that, the potential negative effects of change might actually be a decreased return on investment of financial security. So if the change kind of doesn't have the desired impact, perhaps the potential to become overwhelmed and stressed with the responsibility of managing the change, and possible resentment from the employees because they're not happy with the change or the way it's being managed, particularly if redundancies or significant changes to people's roles are involved in the change. Okay, so that's our potential impacts, positive and negative, on owners of a business. Moving on to the second one, managers. Again, these can be really heavily impacted. Okay, they might have to deal with changes to their own positions or responsibilities, whilst at the same time managing the change process and supporting employees through it. So this can actually put managers in a really, really challenging position. Okay, they might need to change their management styles, maybe brush up on some management skills that they're not particularly strong in. If we're looking at management styles, participative, consultative are probably the way to go. We talked about them. We link back to the low risk strategies here for managing change or overcoming resistance to change, because they're the styles that are usually going to involve the employees. And again, we've talked about many times, involving employees is the best way to go about making change happen. But yeah, particularly difficult for managers. And it's hard sometimes for the employees to see this, because the employees are kind of, all caught up in themselves and the impact on them. Well, change might also be impacting the managers just as much, but that not only do the managers have to manage, the stress and the changes to their own positions and to their own selves, they've got to also help the employees working underneath them through the change. So it's kind of like a double whammy sometimes for managers. It can be really, really, really hard. On the management skills front, managers might need to improve their communication, delegation, planning, leading skills, all that sort of stuff. And whilst they're doing all that stuff, they need to be constantly also monitoring and evaluating the change process, making sure that the goals being set by the business are being achieved. At the end of the day, that's the managers, the core of their job, to make sure that the goals being set by the business are achieved. And for senior managers, might be even more tricky, okay? Providing support and direction for middle and frontline managers beneath them who are feeling the stress of doing all of this stuff. And putting up the same sort of resistance, maybe, even as the frontline employees. Okay, so remember we said before, managers can be either a driving or a restraining force. If managers are not on board with this at various levels within the business, that's how they can end up being a restraining force for change. If they're not on board with it, it's very unlikely then that the employees working for them are going to be on board with it either. So yeah, look, generally it can be really, really challenging, to the point that the employees working for the managers don't even realize that the stress that managers are going through. So look, positive and negative. Look, I'm not going to talk through these for the sake of keeping the video as short as possible as we go through. I don't think there's anything particularly difficult to understand there, but I would pause the video and get those positive potential effects and potential negative effects into your notes. And if you're not understanding any of those, make sure you ask when you get back to class. But that's kind of how I'll roll through each of these. So you can just pause the video at each of these and get them into your notes. But I don't think I need to necessarily talk through each of these. I think they're kind of pretty self-explanatory. Third one was employees. So these are obviously always affected by change within a business. They can find that their tasks or their responsibilities change, the skills that they need to do the job change, the hours they work might change, or even the location of where they work change. So lots and lots of different ways in which the change in a business can kind of play out for employees. Employees are going to react differently. Some are going to be happy with the changes. Some are going to be stressed. Some will be concerned, daunted, scared. This is why it's really important that employees understand why the changes have had to be made, as well as they understand the benefits to them personally and the broader business. Okay, we've talked about that multiple times. There's a lot of crossover between these key knowledge dot points here. They kind of all blend back in to one thing, really. There's so much of this stuff is kind of repeated. So this is why supporting employees through the change is so critical. Okay, Change has been found through surveys to be one of the major causes of stress in the workplace. No surprise there. As most leading businesses are now basically in a constant state of change. So we're not in a, it's not the case now that a business is, okay, this is how we are, we want to change and we'll make a change and then we just stay like that. It's constant change. The world that we live in now is changing and evolving all the time. So basically, a lot of big businesses now are just in this state of constant change, okay? So one of the things I actually look for in their employees when they're hiring, recruiting, is a proven ability to be adaptive and ability to learn. Okay, so you're actually seeing a lot of job ads now, particularly in senior positions, but even in some more junior ones. When it identifies, what they're looking for in a potential employee, often there is some stuff in there around, the ability to adapt, the ability to learn. And that's because businesses are in this state of constant change, and it's going to be easier to employ people who kind of are ready for that, are used to that, have experience of doing that, rather than those that don't. So yeah, it's actually even changed the way that businesses recruit. Hiring people like that makes it a lot easier in the long run for the managers who then manage them. Okay. Again, here is our potential positive and our potential negative impacts on the employees. Some of this stuff we probably already talked about when we were talking about change previously, but again, pause the video, get those down into your notes, and if you're unsure of what any of those mean or need further explanation, just ask. Then we have our customers, the fourth group. So customers might find that the products they like are no longer available or have been changed in some way, okay? The way products that are accessed might have been changed. So basically, to minimize the impact of these effects, businesses need to keep customers informed, okay, fully about any of the changes that they're making in this area. In a similar way too with employees, the business must also make sure that customers understand the benefits of the change to them. And if they don't do this, they risk losing those customers or potential customers. Okay, pretty straightforward. Again, here's some potential positive and negative effects, which I will leave you to pause the video and get down into your notes. Question if you do not understand any of those. And look, just to give you an example here, I just thought this is a good one to give you an example so that you kind of get what we're talking about. Glad wrap. Glad Australia, this was a few years ago now, so this is not something to use as an example. This is just here to help you understand what I'm talking about. So this was 2015, by the looks of it on these headlines. They moved the position of the cutter on the Glad wrap packaging. Okay, lots of customers complained. Many switched to another brand. Fairly quickly, they put it back where it was originally to get those customers back. So customers were not happy with the change that was made to the product, and they made that known by switching to alternative brands. Sephora. This again was also a few years ago now. So this one was, and this actually there were a few other businesses which kind of came up against a similar problem. So Australian customers were furious after being blocked from the US website. So obviously now in this globalized world in which we live, businesses have, if a business is operating multinationally, there's, the Australian version of their website, the UK version, the American, whichever markets they're operating in. So what was happening was you had Sephora operating in Australia, their online store. And what people were doing, or the Sephora customers were doing, was looking at the US website and looking at the prices of, how much you could buy the same product for in the US as opposed to Australia, obviously taking exchange rates into account. And what they found was that for some reason it was a lot more expensive in Australia. And that was annoying. So basically what Sephora did was just blocked access to the US website from Australia so that people could make those comparisons. And Sephora customers felt that they were being a bit sneaky and hiding the fact that they were ripping us off because people could no longer make these comparisons. So yeah, there were other businesses also kind of came up with similar issues, because often the case is in Australia, for some reason, we end up paying a lot more for stuff than they do in other countries. Apple is actually another example of that. For some reason, we pay more in Australia, even after you take into account conversion, exchange rates. For some reason, we seem to pay this Australian Apple tax. Not quite sure why. Anyway, is what it is. Stakeholder 5, suppliers. Look, when businesses are undergoing change, it might be that suppliers lose their contract with a business through change, or there might be changes made to supply contracts and specifications in terms of what the suppliers are supplying to the business. So, for example, if a business is losing money, or at least not making as much profit as they were planning on making, it might go through a cost-cutting exercise. We've seen cost-cutting already now. So that might include reevaluating all of their supply contracts and maybe searching for new lower cost suppliers. So if the supplier has competitors whose price they're unable to match, it might mean that they lose the contract, okay, which obviously has a big negative impact on that supplier. Now that can be particularly a really, really big problem for that supplier if a large chunk of their business comes from supplying the contract that is now lost. And that's the case with a lot of businesses. McDonald's in particular, for example, a lot of the businesses that supply the ingredients, either the whole or most of their business is supplying McDonald's. So if they lose the McDonald's contract, they're kind of up a creek without a paddle, they then have to find new business from somewhere else, which is not easy to do. So this can be really, really key when we're going through change. So again, the usual table, positive and negative, get those into your notes. Again, nothing in there I don't think is too hard to understand, but if you're not understanding, make sure you ask. And then the final one is the general community. So if a business decides to relocate, for example, there's going to be a loss of direct employment in that local community. This is why I was talking before about regional or country towns. If you've got a big business base there, a lot of the people that live in that town might be employed by their business. Wouldn't be so impactful in a city like Melbourne because, if a business closes, it's not like, half of Melbourne's going to lose their job. But that can be the case in other parts of Australia. But not only that, there's going to be a knock-on effect to other local businesses because people then might have less money to spend on their products and services, okay? If a lot of the employees move with the business, then there's going to be a decreased local population. And then, of course, there's less customers for other businesses as well. So, yeah, there's lots of knock-on effects. It's not just the direct impact of people not having jobs. It's then that they don't have money to spend in the town. And you then can often find that other businesses end up closing down as well. If a business decides to expand, so now we're kind of going the other way, there might be traffic implications for the local community that need to be taken into account. So down there, again, regional towns can be hugely impacted, particularly if one or two local businesses employ a large number of local people. And I've got an example here, and I've just thrown this one because Bega is a town I'm very familiar with, up on the New South Wales south coast. You'll know Bega cheese. So I know the factory that's made in the town of Bega. So Bega cheese, a brand that people can truly feel good about purchasing. We employ close to 1,600 people, probably 98% of which are in rural areas within the region. So a very close relationship and affinity with our communities, blah, 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 blah. So the key there is they employ 1,600 people. Now, I believe the population of Bega itself, the town, is something like 5,000 people. And obviously the people that work at the factory will come from a bit further afield, but it is a big, big local employer. So if something did happen and Bega decided to no longer operate where they have done for many years, imagine the impact on the town. Okay, if they close down a facility, move production elsewhere, all of those people, a large proportion of the town will no longer have a job. So obviously there's that direct impact, but then, how are the cafes and all the other businesses in the town going to fare because people now don't have as much money? So you'll find that, the knock-on effect of something like that happening would be really, really big. And look, there's been cases where around Australia and other countries which have a similar type of geography as Australia, big cities, but then regional towns a long way from anywhere. Those regional towns have kind of closed down almost. That's happened in Western Australia a bit, where mining businesses have closed down a mine. The towns have basically just collapsed. So the impacts here can be really huge. So again, positive and negative, and we've said there can be positives, can be negatives. It depends on what the change the business is making. But again, get those into your notes. So again, you're going to have a few notes for this one. But again, hopefully you don't need to learn this stuff rote. If you understand this stuff, you should be able to come up with these negative and positive impacts, I think, given case material, if you understand, kind of what we're talking about here. And that is it for that particular key knowledge dot point. So I will see you in the next one. I think the penultimate one, number 9. Cheers for now.